This is Monica Perez, joined today by our returning guest, Jeremy Kuzmarov, the managing editor of Covert Action Magazine, and so much more, including the author, excuse me, of a new book with a shocking title and cover. I'm telling you, reading this on airplanes and at like soccer games and stuff was normally people are like, what are you reading? They see this and they're like, I don't want to know. Whatever she's thinking, I don't want to know. It's called Warmonger: How Clinton's Malign Foreign Policy Launched the U.S. Trajectory from Bush 2 to Biden. So they don't know if you're a Republican or a Democrat or whatever. And it is jam packed. It delivers on the title. So hello, Jeremy. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So regular listeners have heard from you before and know your current work, but this is it's such a well documented and well written book that it's obviously, you're obviously a professional. So I wonder if you might remind listeners of your background and credentials, and kind of like, you're no novice when it comes to research and writing. So tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure. Well, I got a PhD in history from Brandeis University. So, yeah, it was a very rigorous program where I think they really help you develop very good research skills. And that, in tackling a topic, you really have to get deep into it to pass, the level they're expecting, to get your dissertation published. So, and yeah, I've done a lot of work in the, or, get it accepted through a committee. I mean, they really grill you and they so I think it teaches you good research methods that you really have to dig deep into a topic. And yeah, when you're researching the kind of topic that I've been researching, it leads you into I guess, a wormhole. I mean, you uncover really dark elements of American life, to upper strata of American politics, because I've researched various presidents, Bill Clinton, and I focus more on liberal presidents because my own leanings are more liberal, as far as philosophy and ideals of government. But I'm just kind of disgusted with the corruption in the Democratic Party and these kind of fake liberal figure like Obama and Clinton. So I studied Obama as well as Clinton. The two books fit together. I've also done a lot of studies on U.S. foreign policy, as well as the distortion of the media sensationalism, and distortions. And the theme running through some of my books, like on the drug war, was my first project, and then the Russiagate, and my third book was called "The Russians Are Coming Again." The first Cold War is tragedy, the second is farce, and it looks at the distortions about Russia and fake hysteria created and fear about Russia that drives very militaristic foreign policy, misguided foreign policy interventions.
A few things, just on that last note, they manifest Russia as the enemy through their behavior. I mean, they're getting closer to making it what they say, but when you go back, especially in your book, there's a whole chapter on Russia, but there are also other things like the Balkans and stuff that play into that, where you can just see. And what I love about it is that I kind of knew that Clinton was responsible for violating that kind of Warsaw Pact buffer zone where the USSR was willing to kind of dismantle itself as long as it had a little bit of breathing room between East and West. And now Clinton led the charge on bringing NATO right up to their borders. Of course, that's something that continues today. And that's kind of the premise of, or a big thesis of the book is to, how did this impact kind of where we are today? And I want to talk about that, but about like kind of your motive and where you came from. They, so you, first of all, I find that when you are talking about controversial subjects like this, you or anyone, and you're saying something that's outside the official narrative, your standards for evidence and conclusions and connecting dots is so much higher than. And I remember this from radio. If I was just going to read what was in the Wall Street Journal, there would be no pushback. Nobody would give me a hard time. But if I wanted to at all poke holes in the official narrative, I mean, I would have 1,000 callers telling me everything they heard on Fox or from Rush or whatever. And you just had to have every last I dotted and T crossed. So I think that your scholarly rigor has to be higher with some of the stuff that's kind of off the message. And then the other thing is, as far as focusing on Democrats, I feel the same way. Like our ideologies are, probably are definitely different when it comes to the role and possibilities of government. I feel like they can't redistribute wealth. I don't can't trust them with that. However, I think we're totally aligned when it comes to foreign policy. And the problem with your own side betraying your ideological values is that they are taking the place of those who would represent you. So if you had an ideologically pure person from the left that you could stand behind, that would be great. But you can't have that because people like Clinton take that place, say that rhetoric, convince voters who think like you that they are going to deliver, and then they don't. Like that's why I liked Ron Paul, but of course would never want Mitt Romney, but Mitt Romney, they're like, well, but he won't, Ron Paul can never win. It's like, that's not, he could if you didn't put Mitt Romney in this place. So I feel like there are that those are good reasons for you to focus the way you do, and I'm sure you get a lot of grief for it.
Yeah, well, I mean, this book really is could be read by anyone, whatever their political outlook. I just tried to do good research and expose the truth about Clinton and Obama, and I did a lot of research into the background. In the Clinton book, the first several chapters address Clinton's time as the governor of Arkansas and the corruption involved in the MENA scandal, where he was covering up clandestine drug flights from Arkansas to the Nicaraguan Contras, and that involved illegal arms and drug smuggling. Um, and that kind of set the groundwork for his presidency. And actually, I found that Clinton was very likely recruited into the CIA in the late 60s when he was a student at Oxford. And his roommate was Strobe Talbot, who came from an old CIA, Yale Skull and Bones family. And the two of them were sent on a mission into Russia to smuggle out Nikita Khrushchev's memoirs. And that was a CIA project, and Nikita Khrushchev had been critical of Stalin. So that served the American purpose in the Cold War. And it was a coup for the CIA. Strobe Talbot actually translated for Time magazine, but Cord Meyer Jr. was a very well-known CIA operative who has been linked in some books to the Kennedy assassination.
Mary Cord Meyer was the what was the name of that book? It wasn't Dr. Mary's Monkey, but it was Cord
Yeah,
Meyer's wife or ex-wife, who was JFK's last
yeah,
mistress, and
last
she was
lover.
found dead on a
Yeah,
jogging trail the day the Warren Commission report came out.
exactly.
And Cord Meyer, two other things about him, he wanted to establish a world government, and he was trying to lure JFK in to that way of thinking. But he also ran Operation Mockingbird, which was the control of the press. I don't know if you know that.
Yeah, I do know about that, and yeah, he was a very influential CIA figure, but he, got drunk one night and admitted on the record that Clinton, he said that Clinton was one of us. He was recruited by the three bad letters, is how he framed it, and I think he was describing this mission into Russia, and it would make sense if you look at how Clinton basically turned his state when he was the governor. Well, firstly, it would account for how does a guy, such a young guy, rise so quickly in American politics. I mean, usually he has people supporting him, very
Yeah.
powerful
And
people.
he's a reprobate.
Yeah,
It's not
and
like
this
he
is
was
exactly.
like, burning the midnight oil to like get straight A's. He was a cokehead and stuff.
Exactly, and actually, he never graduated. He was on the Rhodes Scholarship. He got a Rhodes Scholarship, but then he never graduated because he was accused of sexually assaulting a woman at Oxford. And then the State Department developed a file on him, and they said he was there not to study but to party and network and party and womanize. So this was not a serious student. He was like a playboy from the beginning, very abusive to women. He came from an abusive home. His stepfather abused his mother very badly. And people who grew up in abusive homes, unfortunately, often tend to embrace some of the characteristics of their abuser. And there's strong evidence in Robert Morrow and Roger Stone's book, The Clinton War on Women, that Clinton was a rapist, that his trademark was to bite the lips of women that he raped. And he would threaten. Then he used his Secret Service to threaten these women. And there are suspicious deaths, including a woman he alleged to have impregnated who was a student at the University of Arkansas, and she turned up dead. So there's a dark story there, and I mean he turned the state of Arkansas into a proprietary for the CIA for this MENA contra smuggling operation, and they used local area banks to launder a lot of the money. And Whit Stevens was a key figure in that operation, and he was the head of the largest, Stevens Investment House. If
Oh,
you go to
yeah.
Little Rock, it's the biggest. The biggest building has Stevens. Like when you drive into the city, you see Stevens, and it's the largest hedge fund outside of Wall Street. And Whit Stevens and the Stevens clan were big time donors to Bill Clinton, but they controlled a lot of the banks that were used for money laundering of the MENA drug and arms smuggling operation. And yeah, Stevens was put in charge of like the development organization that Clinton set up that was also used to reward Clinton's cronies and for money laundering operation like in offshore banks. And Hillary Clinton was at the Rose Law was a partner with Vince Foster at the Rose Law Firm, and they were involved in a lot of the legal maneuvering to aid in this basically large scale criminal operations. And then Foster was killed under very suspicious circumstance that looked like murder when he became the White House counsel. So, it all ties together as far as Clinton's CIA background and his time in Arkansas and criminal activities he was associated with, and
That
the pernicious nature of his character as an abuser of women and just a bad man. Even Al Gore's mother, because I read a book where it discussed how when Al Gore brought Clinton, to meet his family, and Al Gore's father was in politics, and his mother had been around politicians her whole life, and that's what she said. She took Al aside, and she's like, "Don't associate with Bill. He's a bad man. I've been around politicians my whole life. I know their character, and there are, I mean, many may be sleazy. Of course, there are some good ones who are decent people." Just trying to get ahead. But she said Bill is a bad guy. Don't associate.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to make the point about the Vince Foster murder. What I'm sure you know about Miguel Rodriguez leaving a letter behind when he resigned as U.S. attorney saying, I cannot support a finding of suicide in the Vince Foster investigation, and I implore you who take my place, which included Brett Kavanaugh, whom I think he mentioned by name, to not allow this to be ruled a suicide. And of course, Brett Kavanaugh did. They all did. And look where he is now. I always thought that whole Kavanaugh circus when he was getting confirmed was a way to keep anyone from looking into that. So, I mean, if you're getting covered up at that high level for so long, obviously, you've got some cover. But I also think it's interesting that somebody of such bad character is just the kind of guy who could make it that far, whom they would recruit. You think you're trying out for internships, you want to be a Rhodes Scholar or whatever, that you need to be the best. But I feel like they don't want that. They want people they can blackmail or who don't have consciences. I mean, that's what my mother used to say. It's like, oh, he's a sociopath.
Clinton, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and sadly, that's the kind of people the CIA want because they're trying to trick people. When they go into foreign countries, they're basically trying to trick people and cause them to commit treason. To give information to them, and they lie, steal, cheat, kill, carry out criminal activities. And so, what kind of people are good at that? It's more the sociopaths.
Yeah, absolutely. But I get a little with him. I guess it's a combination of everything. Like I look at his character, he seems so like greedy and corrupt just for the sensual pleasures or to line his own pockets. It seems so petty. Like I've read other stuff about him and that bank, like how like basically gave loans that never got repaid, if I recall correctly. I don't think you covered that, but So it looks like it's totally like a venal, but then it feels like he's also working for the CIA or, um, you know, not every single thing seems to just go to his pocket. Like he's obviously working for somebody else's agenda. And you brought up an interesting point. Like maybe it was some of his early upbringing, but maybe it was blackmail. Maybe that's how they got to continue to control him. But I was always confused by his motivation in that he just seemed so self-serving, but also was serving a bigger picture.
Yeah, well, there's still mysteries. I mean, I don't purport to know everything about them. I'm sure there's probably even darker secrets. There are limits to what a researcher could do. I mean, I was able to find some whistleblowers, particularly with the Mina affair and the drug smuggling. I found a woman in particular named Jean Duffy, who was on the drug task force in Salina County outside Little Rock, who was involved in prosecution. But since they were leading up to the governor's mansion and associates of Clinton, her investigation was quashed and she was threatened. Her life was threatened and she was forced to leave the state of Arkansas. This was in the late 80s. And there was a group called the Arkansas Committee. That was a group of graduate students at the University of Arkansas, Fayetteville, who were kind of on to Clinton and the Mina affair and his role in the Iran-Contra. And they did a lot of their own investigation. And their papers they've deposited at the University of Arkansas, Fayetteville. So there's a lot of incriminating documents and material there. And then there's published, memoirs of people. So there is, good evidence, but some things I think nobody knows all aspects of the story,
Oh, yeah,
and
and you can't know somebody's, inner motives unless he kept, like, an actual private diary, which he kept a diary, but not like that. But I just wondered if he just seemed so, like, just wanting to stuff his face in his pockets and, bite lips or whatever. And it just yet he did so, paved the way for so much malign foreign policy. And it reminds me of a hashtag I put up when a caller, a very wise caller, said, "You'll never get gun control from Democrats. It will take a Republican," because a Democrat would meet so much resistance from Republicans, and that is how it works. Trump, Reagan, like these were the ones who got the biggest like federal bans on assault weapons or whatever. Seems to me, and I feel like same thing with him and also Obama. Like you had to silence the anti-war left, and you weren't going to do that with a warmongering Republican. Now you've got the warmongering Republicans, but he bridged that. He bridged that whole thing and set it up. And on his watch was Oklahoma City, the first World Trade Center bombing. So the foreign policy that he implemented was brutal and unjustified and world changing. And the implications for us domestically ushered in all this censorship and surveillance, seems to me, and Biden too, because like the OKC and the World Trade Center was what ushered in the first. There was one act that you mentioned there, but I also know that was the beginning of the Patriot Act and all of that. But
Mhm.
so those are the two kind of things I want to get into. Some of his foreign policy trends, like the big broad brushstrokes, because your book, it has a chapter for basically every region where Clinton imposed this new foreign policy, from like the Middle East to Africa, Southeast Asia, Israel, the drug war, and Latin America, a whole bunch of different things. But it seems like he was systematically changing the world. So I don't know if you want to pick an example or give us broad brushstrokes on that. And then I want to hear a little bit about the domestic stuff.
Okay, sure. Yeah, and related to your first point, I think you make a good point that it kind of took a Clinton, somebody who presented this kind of liberal veneer, to be able to really carry out these kind of imperialistic foreign policies. Because, yeah, his function was to basically co-opt the left, the anti-war left of the 1960s. And I think this was why this elaborate image of, I believe that both he and Obama, I mean, their creation of the PR industry, and probably CIA is behind that, other agencies. So they cultivate this image in the Clinton case that, oh, he was this hippie from the 60s, him and Hillary. I mean, there are even images of them dressed in hippie garb, and he was part of the free love movement. They use as womanizing to say, oh, maybe there's some excesses, but he's part of the free love generation, and he protested the Vietnam War.
Right, pot
Although
smoker. Mhm.
it's believed that he was an informant on the anti-war movement because he did participate in anti-war protest in London, but it's believed he was probably an informant. Um, so this was a kind of phony veneer, but and then they had him playing saxophone on the Arsenio Hall show, and his handlers, and then he was asked about marijuana, and he admitted to smoking, but he didn't. He said he didn't inhale, and even Rolling Stone magazine was endorsing him, and their editor Jan Wenner, now the counterculture magazine of the '60s. And Jan Wenner was like, finally, somebody of our generation. But I mean, this guy was an imposter. He was a CIA asset. He was a sociopathic rapist, and he courted, the wealthiest, financial elements in the state of Arkansas. Once he made his, embarked on a political career in Arkansas, which was funded by mob seed money from a relative, Raymond Clinton. His
Oh,
family
really? I
had
missed that.
connection with the Dixie Mafia, and Clinton was supported, yeah, by elements of the Dixie Mafia who were involved in the MENA drug smuggling operation, notably Dan Lassiter, who was his Epstein before Epstein. He was this wealthy, he owned this ranch in New Mexico, and was owned a chain of steakhouses, and was a very wealthy donor to Clinton. But he was also a playboy, and he would have these coke and sex parties that Clinton was involved with. And then he had Tyson Chicken and Stevens Incorporated were supporting him with huge amount of money, and even Walmart. He drew in Sam Walton, who was the big wealthiest guy in Arkansas, and Hillary Clinton was appointed to the board of Arkansas. So this is a phony veneer that he's some kind of hippie leftist guy. He's in league with the biggest financial oligarchs in the state of Arkansas. And his policies, but yeah, he basically adopted Republican policies, or that were Republican policies up until that time, by couched in a liberal rhetoric, and could get away with it. And in foreign policy, because the base was under the liberal base, thought he was one of them, and he presented himself as kind of safeguard against the right wing. The Republican were veering more to the right under Newt Gingrich's leadership in the House, '94 when they took over. So that's how he positioned himself. And then in foreign policy, Robert McNamara had called for a peace dividend. This is the
Mhm.
architect of the Vietnam War, actually testified before Congress, who said the Cold War is over. We don't have a Soviet enemy. There's no reason to be spending such a high military budget. I mean, now's the time to cut our military budget. We have no other
Right.
enemy, and invest in education and healthcare. And that McNamara, the head of the Vietnam War,
Yeah.
architect,
Wow.
but,
Yeah,
but
because I remember when Reagan and Bush kind of like were presiding over the fall of the Berlin Wall, but it's kind of
yeah,
like Reconstruction. So Bill Clinton was there for the kind of Reconstruction era,
yeah.
and it was a facade that he was the guy from the left because yeah, that he had to gin up a whole new global threat.
Exactly, and he did that, and he used this liberal rhetoric to draw in the liberals who had protested against Vietnam and were against a lot of Reagan Bush policies. He packaged, like, Bosnia was a key conflict where he presented he presented the conflict in kind of cartoonish way, that the Serbs were these bad guys, and Milosevic was branded as the new Hitler and was accused of genocide at Srebrenica. other incidents, and he said, "Oh, we have to stand up for human rights, and we can't allow genocide in our lifetime." And he brought in Elie Wiesel, and the
Really?
Jewish man who wrote about the concentration
Holocaust, yeah.
camps in Nazi Germany, and that was meant to kind of equate equivalence with Nazi Germany and the Serbs, and we can't be silent this time and do nothing this time, and that got a lot of people in the liberal camp to support military intervention as a humanitarian initiative. And the conflict was totally distorted. I mean, the Serbs have been trying to keep the Yugoslav Federation together, and there were atrocities on all sides. But actually, at the Clinton Library, there's State Department reports detailing the extensive Croat atrocities against the Serbs. So I mean, each side was fighting the other and killing the other. And I mean, there were atrocities on all sides. The Croats may have committed the worst acts of ethnic cleansing and atrocities. And the U.S. was also supporting the Muslim factions against the Serbs, who were led by Aliza Izetbegovic, who was like a Muslim fundamentalist who had supported, I think, a Nazi Gestapo in World War II and like advocated for an Islamic State. And I think the CIA helped bring in Islamic extremists from Europe and Afghanistan who had fought the Soviets in
Yeah,
Afghanistan.
Al-Qaeda, like, these were the origins,
Yeah,
I believe. Wasn't there were some, I'll bring in the Chechens, if I'm not mistaken, like, there was some recent, uh, reference to how far back they used those tools from Afghanistan to the Balkans to, today.
yeah. So I mean, real humanitarian intervention, and the Croat leader Tuđman also had been pro-Nazi during World War II, and he, muzzled the press, and he was really a corrupt, brutal dictator. And the Croats were committing the worst acts of ethnic cleansing and violence, as detailed in State Department reports at the Clinton Library. So this was far from a humanitarian intervention. And actually, the U.S. then in Kosovo triggered a conflict there by supporting the Kosovo Liberation Army, which had been on the State Department terrorist list. And they were basically inciting the Serbs to try and draw in Western intervention. And then they ultimately helped establish a mafia state. And the U.S. got a huge military base, Camp Bondsteel, out of those wars. So, and a lot of civilians got killed in the NATO bombing. And Milosevic was basically a show trial. He was arrested or kidnapped, taken to The Hague for a show trial, and the U.S. engineered a color revolution to bring in more pro-Western leaders in Serbia, which had been under Milosevic was one of the last socialist leaders left in Europe and had been resisting NATO encroachment. So this was far from a humanitarian intervention. I mean, it fit the pattern of kind of U.S. dirty wars with a certain imperial objective of setting up military bases and undermining one of the last of the more pro-Soviet type leaders in Europe. But this set the groundwork, and that's like part of my thesis is that this is key in recalibrating U.S. foreign policy, developing new pretexts, and setting a groundwork for the humanitarian intervention that were also disastrous, like Libya, Syria. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
the 2 things. One, the our undermining of Yugoslavia was pure imperialism, in my
Yeah.
opinion, because it really had nothing to do with the Soviet Union. It didn't
Mhm.
have the problems. It wasn't collapsing for the same reasons it wasn't. And when you talk to people who, I mean, I know a Croat from before, like his family was old money aristocracy, whatever, and he was like, they stole all our stuff. They kicked us out of the country. It was horrible atrocities to turn it into a communist country. But if you also talk to Yugoslavians from when we orchestrated the collapse, they don't have the same gripes. I've been to Prague and, places like that where you like meet people who were aware of what was going on in those countries at the time. And it feels like that collapse was definitely from the outside and our creating a new world order. And I also feel like we have we always seem to be on the side of the Nazis. Like, I feel like there's like, when you look at Ukraine and you look at like Gladio and you look at these some of our behavior, we blame it on humanitarian or we blame it on ideology, but if you actually scratch the surface, these guys are in bed with anybody, or more often I think Nazis. And then the idea of this humanitarian war, that's something that we're seeing right now. Like I'm predicting that we're gonna have US boots on the ground in Gaza, and the whole reason that Israel went absolutely crazy, or that there's a lot of press about it, for I think this is a plan from long ago, was to justify us going in there. And you'll see it every single day. They talk about atrocities because they're ginning us up for a humanitarian excuse for what's going to be, another like imperialistic occupation, I think.
Yeah, and that's the formula. My argument in the book is that this is the kind of formula established, and Clinton helped to perfect in his role as commander in chief. He gave that rhetoric that made people believe, many liberals, and I discussed the liberal intellectuals who supported this, figures like Todd Gitlin, and those who had been associated with the anti-Vietnam War movement. A huge number, of them prominent liberal intellectuals writing like New York Review of Books or Nation, a lot of them were supporting this as a great humanitarian crusade, and even like progressive political figures like Paul Wellstone supported it. I believe, I'm not sure about Bernie Sanders. He might have supported it too. I believe he did. So
Why though?
Clinton
Why
got
are
these
they?
people on board.
Right?
He hoodwinked
How?
them with
Okay.
this rhetoric, demonizing the Serb, and that's the same. And Clinton was good at it compared to other leaders who don't believe. I mean, Clinton did have certain political talents and gifts, and that's why the CIA may have recruited him early on. Even in the
Lying.
state of Arkansas, he was tied with Winthrop Rockefeller, who was the governor in the 60s, and he had a family connection with Rockefeller. He did have talent. They said he can go to a state fair and win over the people. I mean, he was a bullshitter. They said he's a very good liar. It's a good quality of a politician. So he knew what they wanted to hear. He would say it, and he would never deliver. He only delivered for the Tyson chicken and the Walmart. The regular folk, he didn't deliver, but he had the right words. He gave the good speech. He had the right personality that he could interact well with them. We don't see that too much today. The leader, although I think Biden had something going for him when he was lucid with his, this like grief, and he would empathize, because he had his son, he had tragedy in his life, so he used that card. But I don't think overall Biden's kind of a dud. Whereas Clinton, had a good personality, at least his outward personality. So he could pull it off. He could give that beautiful speech, and you'd be mesmerized that the Serbs are so terrible, and this is America. This is the good use of American power after Vietnam was bad, and we don't want to go there. But this is a good use, and it's only going to be kind of limited scale. And he didn't involve a huge number of American forces. This was carried out a lot. There was and one thing was new with the use of private military contractors. This was subcontracted to private military companies, like who ran the operations. They were running the Croat army. A major offensive like Operation Storm was run by MPRI, a private military contractor, and they were using new sophisticated technology like drones was just coming into use then, and these satellite surveillance systems, and it was entirely carried out by air. So there were no ground troops, no U.S. casualties. So the public didn't have to look too deeply into it, and he could give off that good speech. And I guess he played on the American public is very insular. I mean, our news focuses a lot on developments within the United States, and most Americans are not very well informed, unfortunately, about world affairs. They don't understand the nuances of countries like in Central Europe. So, and they're used to Hollywood films where there's a clear good guy and a bad guy. So they portrayed Milosevic as the bad guy, and that's exactly what they do today. Putin's the bad guy, Kim Jong Un is the bad guy, and America is the good guys. And they use the same kind of rhetoric and package it the way. And Clinton helped develop a formula for these kind of imperialistic interventions that were packaged as humanitarian interventions.
So two things. One is I have a couple of books by Renee Wormser, who was the counsel for the research that Norman Dodd did into the nature of tax exempt foundations for the House Un-American Activities Committee. And I don't know if you've ever seen this famous interview by Edward G. Griffin interviewing Norman Dodd in his old age, who was the researcher. They looked into the Carnegie endowments, um, facilitating of our entry into World War I as a way to change the American culture somewhat. It's very interesting. And but Renee Wormser wrote a book on that, but he also wrote a book called The Myth of the Good and Bad Nation. And it's about how in war, it's always couched in the terms of like there is this entire group of people or a government or whatever that's totally evil, and we're the good guys, and that's always how it's portrayed. And yeah, that it's very simplistic, and it's amazing to me that intellectuals, especially anti-war intellectuals, would fall for that. I mean, he wrote that book, probably 50 years ago. And but I will also say about the lying, I actually feel like they recruit people very young for being for certain qualities, and I would say foremost among those qualities is lying. And a weird little thing that I observed was James Comey, when he was 17, testified against somebody who they were accusing of being the Ramsey rapist in New Jersey, and he went to the mat as a 17-year-old, getting this guy convicted. And later he was released and he was awarded like $3.5 million in damages because he was not the guy. And I always thought that was weird. Like, and I thought they probably like were so impressed by this kid's like complete ability to lie just to be in the limelight or whatever. Maybe I'm not saying things that maybe are not in evidence, but I think they are. But in any case, my opinion was that guy might have been recruited just because of that quality. So I feel like if he Winthrop Rockefeller or somebody was around, although Winthrop Rockefeller, of all the Rockefellers, seems to be like the least bad. And maybe I just think that because he had a daughter who had Down syndrome, if I recall correctly, which was like close to my heart. But if he was around when he was young and people could see that quality, I would say that in itself is enough. Like, I think it is hard to be such a convincing liar, and that would, I mean, it's maybe so powerful that it could convince otherwise ideologically consistent people to, believe him. Although, I mean, on the other hand, those journalists could just have been Democrat shills, maybe, but having a convincing argument to stand behind can give you a lot of cover.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. I mean, yeah, they spotted a talent in Clinton.
Yeah.
I mean, I think he had a talent for giving speeches. He had a gregarious personality, and he had a lack of moral scruples. So he was the perfect guy.
Yeah. And he's a networker. Like, that's how if
Yeah,
you're
he
in
was
a
an
good old
incredible
boys. Yeah.
fundraiser.
Yeah.
They said, he was just incredible. He could raise money from anybody. He could talk anybody into something. And those are very rare qualities. And it's unfortunately, yeah, had he used his qualities and talent for good, he really, although I guess he never would have been president of the United States.
Yes,
But
of course not. So I wanted to talk about the implications on the domestic uh, political scene or policy scene with some of the events that happened while he was president. And one of them, I read this whole book recently called by Wendy Painter called Aberrations in the Heartland of the Real. Have you ever heard of that? It's about the secret lives of Timothy McVeigh.
yes, I did. I believe I read that book
Yeah,
based probably
I
on your
wouldn't be surprised.
recommendation.
Yeah, it was a great book. Very, very
Yeah.
good book. And
Mhm.
similar to yours, like highly documented, making no conclusions that aren't in evidence, very clear. One thing I love about your book, I really love the style of having the notes at the end of each chapter. And they're just very comprehensive and thorough. So if you have any questions like, oh, is that true or whatever, you can just like, it's just a few pages away. I love that style. But what you offered, a one paragraph explanation of OKC and Timothy McVeigh, that I mean could not be, after having read like many hundreds of pages, like could not be, I think, better put. So I want to just read that as kind of like a sample of the book anyway, if you don't mind. It's page 293. It says, in June 2001, McVeigh was executed after being found guilty of masterminding the Oklahoma City bombing along with accomplice Terry Nichols. However, military explosives experts stated that the crudely constructed bomb linked to McVeigh that was detonated in a Ryder truck could only have torn the flooring from a few floors in the Murrah building. Many eyewitnesses heard two explosions, and a former CIA agent on the scene, Joe Harp, said he smelled sulfur, indicating daisy cutter bombs used by the U.S. Army in Vietnam. Local news media reported unexploded bombs located in the Murrah building. The FBI at the time had infiltrated provocateurs into the Elohim Ranch outside Oklahoma City, a mecca for radical white nationalists. McVeigh was believed to be one of these infiltrators who may have been set up as a patsy as part of his last Army assignment, along with Nichols, McVeigh's old Army buddy, who met with Islamic terrorist groups that had been infiltrated by U.S. intelligence in the Philippines. I mean, that really, I mean, if you wanted a synopsis of that event, that's just fantastic. And it's, of course, documented. But I feel like in every chapter, you take massive events like that and can distill them into one paragraph that just tells you exactly what people say happened, what really happened, and what the significance is. And that's why, and it was a page turner, really. So I just thought that was a good example. And it also explains OKC to people who might not know. And you can look at the documentation, look at the notes, pull on those threads, read that great book, if you want to know more. But I just like that just event after event is in a nutshell here. But yes,
Thank you. I
these
appreciate
events,
that. Yeah, I was
it's
trying
great.
to make it kind of synthesize a huge, because I researched this topic over years and had to read hundreds of books. So yeah, I'm just trying to summarize certain key events. It's a fairly dense book, but hopefully readable and a good
Very
resource
readable.
for researchers who'd want to investigate further. Because I think a lot of time the official story is wrong. And I'm trying to get it out there that more people understand the true history, and that those who are interested in probing into the truth can refer to my notes and do some broader reading, like into events like
If
Oklahoma City
you
or
can see how, like, I have every single page. This is so highly annotated of like, oh, I want to learn more about this, ask me about that. I mean, every page is just like that. And however, so there's just anything more you wanted to know, but uh, I have very little tolerance for like the too dense reading. If it's super intellectual and it's worth reading the paragraphs a couple of times, like Guido Preparata is an example of like somebody who's just so packed with ideas that I'll read it a couple of times. But what I absolutely have no tolerance for is history that is so full of details that you really don't get the idea. It's just, you get bogged down. And I always feel like that's an author who wants you to know how much research you did. But the real work is when you synthesize that, like literally organically in your mind after many years of understanding something and putting it together. And then you can explain it in a simple, short way that you can stand behind. That's the other thing. I think people will overwrite if they don't want to own what their synthesis of it. So, I mean, I'll do that sometimes on the air, for like, I don't understand, like I'm reading this newspaper thing and I'm not going to just regurgitate it. I'm going to read it to you because I'm not even sure it's true, but I'm sure that I'm reading this. So I feel like it takes that's the real value added, is that breadth of knowledge, but the synthesis that makes it accessible and as a place to kind of launch off. Really great.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
You're welcome. And then also, I wanted to understand that with some of these false flags, the other one was World Trade Center 93, where 6 people were killed, but I think hundreds of people were injured. And I had written a note in the side, like, don't forget Ahmad Salem. And sure enough, when I turned the page, you're like, The FBI had an informant in there who was waiting for the explosives to be traded out with dummy explosives, and it never happened. And that I have actually, there's that guy, Imad Salem, had recorded his conversations with his FBI handler, which I had on my website. It's probably been far forward by now. But those were two big events that I would say opened the door intentionally. That's why they were orchestrated, in my opinion, to this surveillance state that Biden seems to have his hands all over, but it was under Clinton's watch. Do you see Clinton's policy? Because that all folded together, like this idea of terrorism as the enemy. And then what do? We need money for wars abroad, but we also need to crack down internally. That was the other big theme I felt like from Clinton's era.
Yeah, he was key in orchestrating the war on terror. It started under Ronald Reagan. And yeah, what I generally found as a pattern in my study of American politics is that I think they want to whip Americans into into the two-party system and as cheerleaders for particular parties. But I think you actually see a lot of continuity in policy and practice, whoever's in the White House. And yeah, the style of a Clinton and a liberal might be able to actually do more damage because the liberal left sectors are are worried about the Republicans coming back into power, think they're evil, so they're prone to defend a Clinton or an Obama, and they get away with more, and they package it in a certain liberal rhetoric that's designed to diffuse anti-war or any kind of political activism. And that may be why the CIA really cultivates and prefers these kind of leaders. Now, as far as these appear to be false flag operations. I think because you have a deep state, which I think would could be hard to define, but I would define as like elements of the military industrial complex and military intelligence industrial complex, and they want a state of permanent conflict, and they want high budgets. And you had a McNamara. So with the end of the Cold War, the enemy is defeated. So you have even a McNamara saying it's time for the peace dividend. So what do? You have to manufacture fear of a new enemy. So it's humanitarian intervention and it's terrorism out of the Middle East. But really, I mean, most people aren't insane enough to attack America or suicidal. So you have to manufacture these threats. And the FBI and CIA sinisterly plant provocateur and carry out, actually they're the ones carrying out the terrorism in many cases, or they're inflaming or provoking extremists within a group like Al-Qaeda, encouraging them, or they're just allowing them into the country when they know they could easily stop them. But they want these fanatics to do it because they have their own agenda. And when you have a corrupt guy like Clinton who's putting in place a corrupt apparatus and all the key positions, including the Attorney General's office, this is never going to be investigated. And Clinton is an asset of the CIA, most likely. So that event looks really suspicious. Yeah, there's clear evidence of FBI provocateur providing the bomb material, and this caused the death of that kind of set in motion the fear of terrorism in the public. And there were, I forget the casualty total, as you say, there were at least 6 or 8 people killed because it went off in the garage.
It was a failure.
Yeah, it was a failure.
It was a failure. I think that the plan was something much greater. And of course, it's hard to even imagine that anyone would want that, except for that we see 9/11, we see OKC.
Yeah, and this was all building up to 9/11, I think. They wanted this big war in the Middle East that would be a boondoggle for the military-industrial complex, and creation of the Department of Homeland Security and the Patriot Act. And I guess their dream is more dictatorial. They want to do away with traditional liberty that Americans value, and that will only occur if the public is in a state of fear and panic over terrorism. They'll start to sign away their liberties. So there's a pattern of false flag operations from the 93 World Trade Center attack, Oklahoma City bombing. And what came out after was, Clinton signed the legislation that was a precursor, the Anti-Terrorism and Death Penalty Act of
What was that?
96,
I'm just
1 year
looking for
after the
that.
Oklahoma City bombing, was a precursor to the USA Patriot Act, and it vastly increased the FBI budget, surveillance powers. It limited suspects' habeas corpus rights. And I summarize all the details. In fact, in the book, or give a summary of it, that bill was first conceded by Theodore Shackley and the CIA,
Oh,
and
I
that
thought it
was
was Biden.
well, Biden championed this kind of
Got it.
legislation, but Theodore Shackley was a sinister guy in the CIA, and he first developed this kind of legislation. And that's the dream of the CIA. They dream of total control and surveillance over society, and it's a more authoritarian model of government, antithetical to the ideals of the American founding fathers and American Constitution. And that's why the CIA should be viewed as an enemy, in my opinion, by all Americans. They manipulate political events, and they are leading the United States off a cliff, in a direction of authoritarianism, just as they package it as, oh, we have to stand up and fight authoritarian regimes abroad, but they're engineering things to make America into a autocracy, and they support, whether it's surveillance, censorship, and this kind of legislation. And Clinton was the great one to deliver it because, again, the liberal base is not protesting Clinton. He makes it seem like he's saving the country from the far right, and that he this ex hippie who is promoting these humanitarian wars to fight genocide abroad, and that he's this champion of human rights. Yeah, he's decimating human rights domestically after public opinion has been manipulated through these false flag terrorist acts that kill many innocent people. And the Oklahoma City bombing resulted in over 100 and I forget how many died, but hundreds
Many and
died.
babies.
Many kids, yeah, even a daycare center. And they were just horrible tragedy. And even there was CNN recently reported, amazing reporting for CNN, that there was a police officer named Terrence Yeeke who was getting at the truth. He was on the scene and he knew some things about Oklahoma City, and then he was just murdered, and they made to look like it was a suicide.
The frightening me says Terrence Yeeke didn't kill himself.
Exactly. He did
Yeah, that
not
was
kill
right up there.
himself. And now even CNN reported the truth. It took like 20 or 30 years, but CNN reported what had been known before, that he was murdered to cover up the false flag operation in Oklahoma City.
There were other people on the scene there. Merrick Garland I think he might have been in charge of the investigation back then, and
Hmm.
look where he's
Yeah,
gotten. But
exactly. Yeah.
there was a bomb expert named Donald Sachleben. You ever hear of Donald Sachleben? No one's
I,
ever heard of him, but
no.
he was a bomb expert called into Oklahoma City, and then remember when the second underwear bomber was, like, outed, before do you remember that story? It was, I think, so, like,
Yeah,
during the
Richard Reed, was it? Or
yeah, yeah, it
yeah.
was that whole thing, and, yes, and the second underwear bomber, it never went off, whatever, and it ended up, like, MI6 was involved, there was a Yemeni bomb maker, whatever. The whistleblower, I mean, I read this, like, in the New York Times or Washington Post or something, but the whistleblower was this Donald Sachleben, and, I was thinking that maybe he was just so disgusted by what happened in Oklahoma City that he just couldn't tolerate them doing something else like that. Well, anyway, you never really heard from him because, by what the New York Times or the Washington Post called a, quote, bizarre coincidence, he was caught with tons and tons of kiddie porn on his work computer, and plea bargained his way into going to jail for a while, and you just never heard from him again. But he was on the ground at Oklahoma City, and I mean, he's lucky that he didn't kill himself.
Yeah, you find some suspicious deaths. And
Yes,
in the
certainly.
MENA, there was, Jerry Parks was a Secret Service agent in Arkansas, who had done some work for the Clintons, and he had, been at MENA, and he had compiled a file and had detailed knowledge of Clinton's connection to the MENA drug smuggling. And then his wife, Jane Parks, owned an apartment complex where Roger Clinton had rented an apartment. And she, like, in her office, she would overhear Bill would come over, and they were having these drug sex orgies, and, like, the girls were underage. and Jerry Parks had amassed a huge file on Clinton, and then he was assassinated mafia style, like he was driving his car and gunman. This is on the eve, I believe, of the '92 election. Clinton had to make sure that this stuff would never come out so he could get to the presidency, and he died in a mafia style hit. And there are a lot of stories like that. I mean, we recently had Mark Middleton, who was the liaison between Clinton and Jeffrey Epstein, and he had been White House chief of staff, and he knew all about Clinton's campaign violations. And he was found shot like 5 times outside of Little Rock, and it very much looked like he was murdered by some
Well,
kind of. They're mafia elements that were protecting Clinton or were connected with him in the state of Arkansas.
and they want you to know. They don't want you to think they want you to know it wasn't really a suicide or this guy
Yeah, I
was
mean, it's
hit.
so obvious. If a guy's shot
Yeah.
5 times in the
Yeah.
chest
They
and
wanna make
then
sure you know
his
that you're in
throat is
danger.
slashed, he's obviously killed.
The boys on
Was
the
murdered.
tracks,
So,
frightening me
but
says too, the boys on the
yeah,
tracks.
yeah, I go into that in the book. And yeah, Linda Ives' son, she investigated for years, and she got on Clinton's enemy list. And this is, she was trying to investigate the truth about her son. Kevin Ives was just 17, 16 or 17, and he just went out for a night with another friend. They were just kind of horsing around and like smoked a joint or something. But then they saw some drug drops, and they saw some criminal activity related to the MENA drug smuggling, and they were murdered, and the murder was covered up. And Linda Ives said it went, she said, and she died just a few years ago, but she was really tenacious in investigating, getting at the truth. And before she died, she said, well, Bill Clinton wasn't personally on, because they died at the train tracks, and their bodies were placed on the tracks and run over. It was made to look like they were run over by a train, but really the bodies were placed there. And she said, well, Clinton may not have been there on the night of the tracks and didn't directly kill them, but their deaths ultimately was his, went right up to him, and he bears the responsibility because he covered it up. He basically was paying off the medical coroner in the state of Arkansas named Fahmy Malak to write these fake reports, medical reports, and he gave money to Malak and ensure his promotion. And that was one way he aided in the cover up. And I mean, it was because this could have exposed the whole MENA operation. So he had to make sure that death was covered up and what was really about and who was behind it. And it was his supporter. There was a guy, Mark Harmon, who was a district attorney, who was a Democrat and a Clinton loyalist. He was behind some of these murders, and particularly he's considered to be connected to the murder of those boys.
Yeah, I think that did Linda Ives write the book, The Boys on the Track? I think she wrote a book about
No,
it.
she didn't write the book. There was a book written by a journalist. I was in touch with her. She wrote, the name is escaping me. I'll remember it. I have it actually
I know I
on
have
the
it too, and I'm
shelf
certain
here.
that you've read it, knowing you.
She wrote 2 books. This is a very good local journalist.
Yeah.
He wrote 2 books, including Had the Boys on the Tracks. I forget. I have it somewhere here. I'm drawing a blank on the author's name.
Yeah, I'm
But
sorry. I didn't mean
Unsolved
to put you on
Mysteries
the spot.
also did a segment on it. And yeah, this was an excellent book by this female journalist.
I'll put it in the show notes,
Yeah.
monicaperezshow.com,
Once I
so people
remember,
find it.
it'll come back to me any minute
I mean, I
when
have it behind this screen, but I can't pull that
Yeah.
down. So there's one thing I wanted. One last question, and then we can wrap it up because I don't want to give away the whole book. But I mean, we just only really tapped on maybe 2 or 3 or 4 of the specifics. But this entire book is just, each chapter is like an assertion and then just page after page of evidence in a very easy to read way, and then documentation, so it's just jam packed with what we're talking about. We haven't even scratched the surface, but a big picture question that I have, and I've often had, I just want your opinion on it. It's very clear to me that there's like a Bush Clinton and then even Obama continuum there. And I wonder if the Bushes always seem to stand out as having an independent power base kind of, but yet at the same time, I always think of, Bush was the head of the CIA. I think of this thing as being, over many decades of CIA operations from JFK's assassination, where Bush also, his name comes up in that. And I just wonder, do you think that there are different little power bases, or is it just one big CIA operation? Is anybody exempted from that? I mean, I think maybe even Reagan and JFK and Nixon all had their connections, and they were all taken out or attempted to be taken out. I always feel like because they stepped off, or whatever, they kind of went a little bit rogue. But I see that continuum there. And do you see that this is like the same kind of grand conspiracy, or are people really struggling for power and sometimes winning?
Well, I mean, I think there are power struggles that occur. Yeah, clearly, and there may be different faction. There could be different factions of the CIA supporting different political leaders. I mean, I think Bush and Clinton had a connection together. In that case, there's pictures of the two together.
In Mina.
With Iran. Yeah, what's that?
In
Oh,
Mina,
no,
I
not in
think.
Mina.
Oh,
No.
no? Or Oliver
I don't
North
think they were that
testified,
brazen about going to Mina together.
or Bill
Uh,
Barr, like, somebody actually testified, or, like, some official was that they were both involved in that, but okay, there's no pictures of them together there.
well, I don't know that Bush ever directly visited
Right.
Mina, but I mean, Bush
That would be
was a
crazy.
key figure in the Iran-Contra operation, and, Bush had been head of the CIA and was connected with Oliver North and Theodore Shackley and, the secret team, that was involved in all kinds of criminal activity in Iran-Contra. And I mean, Bill Clinton, was a key figure in Iran-Contra as well with the MENA. So, I mean, they're working together in essence, and they had even a personal relationship. So,
Yeah, oh, did
um,
you ever hear of when they thought Bush, the father, was going to die, and they wanted to decide whether George W. Bush or Bubba would say the eulogy? That's how close they were. They were gonna have
yeah,
Bill Clinton, who went by the name Bubba, say the eulogy for George Bush over his own son. It didn't come to
wow,
that because he lived, like, he didn't die that time, but that's how close they were. That, I think, that was in a leaked, like, email or something.
yeah. And I mean, look, it shows how limited Americans have as far as choices in election. Because the '92 election, you have two CIA men vying for power, two deeply corrupt individuals.
And Skull and Bones the next time, right? Wasn't Bush and Kerry, they were both in Skull and Bones? The
Exactly.
second one, the second Bush? Yes.
Yeah,
So
so, I mean, and then there's the spoiler Ross Perot in that '92 election, but he didn't really, have much of a chance, and actually, there was a short section in the book where an FBI whistleblower, told me that he was sent on a mission to undermine Ross Perot during that election and also to help elect Clinton. um, so, I think the intelligence agencies and deep state play a greater role in elections than most people fathom or realize.
right. Yeah, so, uh, it's all so fascinating to me, but what's most important, I feel like, is that, you present evidence and documentation, because people will deny the true nature of power in this country and, in the world, and it really matters because they believe things that these same unreliable sources in the media and in, government do, things that, like, will cost you your life and your livelihood. I mean, the whole COVID thing was just an exercise. The COVID policy that descended upon the world was an exercise in popular trust in media and government, and that's dangerous. It's going to be the end of us if we don't wise up, and this is a good way to start. If anybody who
Yeah.
likes to want to know about the real details, for, I mean, this covers, like, his term, which is 8 years of just nonstop shenanigans. Anyway, it's a
Yeah,
great
and
book.
there's probably more out there to uncover, but,
Oh, yeah, but you curated it so well, like, even what you did uncover, I mean, it's just very, very well written. How long did it take you to write this?
I researched it over a long period.
Yeah.
I did a lot of the writing, not all, during the COVID, during the
Oh,
lockdown.
perfect, yeah,
There was
great.
nothing else to do, nowhere
Make
to
the most of
go.
it, yeah.
So I would just hammer out, at least 2/3 of the book probably was written up in that period, and then maybe just fine-tuned a bit after, and a lot of the reading and research, yeah, I did, a good
Well
bulk then, but I had started it well before that,
well, you must have for your work on Russia and Obama and
yeah,
everything.
and
I mean,
some of
this
the
stuff is
topics I've been because, yeah,
same.
there are chapters on, like, Russia, on Central Africa, so I had been doing research on those conflicts and US policy, for other articles or some like in the Russians Are Coming Again book, I had done a lot of, which was published in 2018, but written more like 2015, 2016. I did a lot of research on US-Russia relations, including in the 90s, and looked at the U.S. promotion of shock therapy and NATO expansion. So a lot of the material and research, yeah, it was carried out over years because I researched the Rwanda conflict. That's another case where I think the public was totally misinformed. That it was claimed that the U.S. didn't, the bystander the genocide, and Clinton said he regretted we didn't stop to halt the genocide. But really, that was a regime change operation where the U.S. was supporting the Rwandan Patriotic Front against the Hutu who had been supported by France. And the U.S. wanted to use Kagame and the Rwandan Patriotic Front as a proxy to gain influence in the Congo and encourage, which is a mineral and diamond rich country where a lot of the raw material for electronics comes from. And so they encouraged his invasion and funded, provided military and intelligence support once Kagame was installed in power for his invasion, along with Uganda in the mid to late 90s of the Congo. And that really devastated the Congo. And that punctured the myth of humanitarian intervention. I
Right.
mean, this is one of the worst
Yeah, right.
human rights atrocities going on in
Yeah.
the world that few people paid much attention to, but millions of Congolese were killed by these marauding forces supported by
Millions?
the Clinton administration. I would put the number probably in the
Wow.
millions.
Wow.
Uh,
Or
and
whatever. I
yes,
mean, if it's up there 6 or 7 digits, that's crazy. I mean, that's
huge amount were killed. And then the humanitarian crisis, and there were mass rapes. These Rwandan militias were just horrific, and a lot of them, the genocide in the '94 was really a lot of the crimes were committed by them. The Rwandan Patriotic Front had invaded Rwanda illegally from Uganda, and then their leader Paul Kagame sabotaged. There was supposed to be a power sharing agreement that was being worked out in Tanzania, and Kagame shot down the airplane, probably with U.S. and CIA procured missiles, murdered the Hutu president, and that's what triggered the mass killing. And a lot of the killing were carried out by the Rwandan Patriotic Front, although the media made it seem like the Tutsi were the victim of the Hutu, and the Hutu did
uh,
kill. Both sides were killing each other after the president, but the triggering event was the shooting down of the airplane of the president, of the Hutu president, by Paul Kagame and the RPF, possibly with CIA support, and that was the first step in their regime change operation. And Kagame had been trained in psychological warfare in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas.
whoa.
And so this whole Rwanda genocide is a psychological warfare operation because the key culprits in the mass killing in Rwanda and Congo are the Rwandan Patriotic Front supported by the U.S. government and CIA and Clinton administration. And Clinton was very close with Kagame and called them like the greatest leader of our lifetime. And he's considered an African Hitler and the worst mass killer in possibly in African history. He murdered 3 heads of state. He
Wow.
murdered leaders in the Congo, and he murdered the Hutu president of Rwanda. and they set up open air crematorium because they were killing so
I
much.
was
They had
wondering,
nowhere to dispose the
yeah,
bodies.
how could you deal with that? Wow, that's just and
And
that
this guy was like heralded by Clinton as a great leader of our time and like a new face of democracy in Africa, with the Ugandan leader who's a murderer in his own right, and he's still in power, Yoweri Museveni, and Clinton heralded him as the new face of democracy, and he's still in power 30 something years later,
wow. I mean, that
killing, and
just
he's compiled an impressive record of butchery in Uganda, and is like a tyrant like Idi Amin was. So
and that's just a testament to many things, but to how corrupt our press is, that it just
yeah,
doesn't so, I mean, there is absolutely no newspaper with broad reach that would ever touch anything like that, and I was just thinking of, like, stuff that's gone away, Huffington Post and Gawker or whatever, like, things have gone away that maybe would have been could have, uh,
yeah.
even on the internet, I'm saying, like, you can't even get
Yeah, well, there
any
was one journalist who reported on it. He wrote a important book, and his name was Wayne Madsen. But the
Oh, I've
book
heard of
was
him.
so heavily censored, you cannot get it anywhere. Well, I
Wow.
think you can get it on Amazon, but you have to
Probably
pay like
$1,000.
$200,
Yeah.
and it's hard to order. Although you might be able. I was able to get it through a college library through interlibrary loan, so I didn't have to pay $200. But I don't know if a public library, unless you're at a university, because there are some university libraries that have it, a small number, but it's very hard for the anyone to get that book. But that exposes the truth of the Clintons' policy, and he visited, like he really did the investigation where he traveled there, and he saw a lot of Western like Green Berets, even the hotel he was staying in,
Wow.
and this was like a secret intervention with nobody knew about in the U.S. public.
Wow. I mean, that should be in the newspaper, like, even if
Yeah,
you could get the book,
and
you
if
I
this
mean, you
guy
have to
could
look
get, I
for
mean, he
that.
was independent. I don't know how he funded himself. He had his own website at one point. I don't think he was working for
Yeah,
any
I've definitely heard
newspaper.
of him.
He was a naval intelligence veteran, and he traveled there. So if any journalist had traveled, and I think it was safe. I mean, he was staying in safe areas, so he didn't risk his life. Like, but he saw for himself the American presence, and he interviewed people. It wasn't hidden in the country that the United States was quite significantly involved. So anyone who went there and started asking some questions would get the information.
But
But the
our guys
media
don't
doesn't do that. Yeah,
they don't worry about us.
they're given reports from the White House or the state. They're just like stenographers
Right.
for the White House or the State Department. So what we
Cord
get
Meyer
on foreign
started that.
reporting is this propaganda, and that's what allows a Clinton or a Biden to carry out these humanitarian intervention, because the public doesn't really know what's going on in that country.
And Cord Meyer is the one who brokered deals between journalists and the military, like, if you can be embedded, but you have to send the message that we want, which is similar to the mandate, of Clinton. Was it, Dick what was his, like, PR guy who fell out of favor with him? Um, Dick Morris.
Dick Morris, yeah,
Yeah, so it's the same thing. It's like he said to him, "What?" I guess the legacy was, "What's your I'm here. I have this opportunity to do all these things." And Dick Morris was like, "Yeah, but you're not going to be able to do anything if you don't get elected." It's that compromise. And the same thing, something about the mandate. I need to fulfill my mandate. Is like, well, you're not going to have one if you don't get elected. But same thing with Cord Meyer. Like, what's the point of being a journalist embedded if what you observe firsthand is you're not allowed to print it? You're only allowed to print what's on the memo. So what is the point? And I think that's where we've come, where I'm aware that like foreign desks are basically unheard of anymore for journalistic outlets. And the few kind of people on the ground who are there, I've heard firsthand or secondhand that they complain that what they do write is totally rewritten by the time it is published in any kind of widely circulated US media. So they don't
yeah.
have to worry about
That's
us.
really sad, because that means you either I mean, most of us want to be successful in our career, their life, but to be successful these days, you have to compromise any integrity, and that's sad. Yeah.
Right, and then what's the point? It's just it's not a
And
great
then you kinda
place.
lose your soul, yeah,
Yes.
if you go that route, and, a lot of people just can't. If you have a conscience, if you're raised a certain way, you just can't stomach it. I mean, either you're gonna get physically ill,
Yes. Yeah,
or you just have to quit.
yeah,
And so it's only a certain type of, and that relates to what we were discussing at the beginning, like in the political world, the only people who get ahead are these sociopathic people who have no conscience at all, who could just lie and don't care. A normal person who's raised with some decent values, would feel bad that he's lying. He just can't do it. I mean,
well, you were a professor, right? And you didn't lie. How'd that go over?
well, I think academia bears a lot of the same features as the journalistic world now. I think there's a lot of self censorship. Certain topics you just know not to touch. So they're not necessarily lying, but they're just not,
Yes,
they're
right, of
teaching
course.
half
It's
truths.
omission.
And I mean, I feel as a historian that my job is to teach the history. I mean, a lot of the history is bad, whether it's American history, whether it's Russian history, whether it's European history. I mean,
Yeah.
humans aren't exactly kind to one another.
I mean, it's a
There's
story
always
of
people
a
out there
power struggle, of a
about money and power.
1,000-year
So,
power struggle, yeah.
yeah, if I'm going to teach American history, which interests me because it's close to home, I'm not going to get up there and say Bill Clinton was a great man, or
Right. He
oh,
did what he had to do.
to just repeat what the government said about Vietnam. I mean, it's all a lie. So I mean, I'm going to try and teach the history, and so students can learn. I mean, the point of a history education is to learn, not to sugarcoat the history, but to learn from history, learn from mistakes, to see pattern. If you have corruption in government, military industrial complex, and they're constantly deceiving the public. Well, there is also history of people who stood up against that, who fought back, who tried to reform the government with some success even. So I would like to teach that kind of history to inspire people to be engaged politically, to see through lies and propaganda, and to challenge the system in a constructive way. So I feel I'm doing positive for society. But unfortunately, a lot of education has become corrupted. You have to look at the board of trustees of universities who controls it. It's often these wealthy billionaires, and they don't want a real education. They want a sanitized version of history. They want to groom people to work, in the managerial class, and they don't want free thinking. So it's hard for people like me to be able to work in that environment, and that's what's happening, sadly, in academia. And they're also cutting jobs. They're cutting the humanities, so there are very few jobs available, and that put also further pressure on young people who feel they have to conform to keep that few job. It's a cherished job if they get a full-time job teaching at a university. So they're going to be very careful what they say, but they're self-censoring themselves. And I think that's antithetical to democracy. I mean, I think a free education system where you have free speech, freedom of thought and ideas, and can look critically scrutinize political affairs and history is vital to functioning democracy. And that's why we're losing our democracy. And that's another realm, just like what I was describing about the kind of laws Clinton enacted, like the precursor of the USA Patriot Act, is basically Americans signing away their democracy. And this corruption of higher education, corruption in the media is part of that as well, that our democracy has become eroded. And that's a
Well
tragedy.
well, I appreciate especially that, you're willing to cross that, partisan, break the 11th commandment of Ronald Reagan. The 11th commandment was like, don't speak ill of a Republican. If you're a Democrat or from the left, don't speak ill. But that's how they keep everybody in check on both sides. So I'm going to recommend, I cannot recommend highly enough this book that you just wrote, Jeremy Kuzmarov, Warmonger: How Clinton's Malign Foreign Policy Launched the U.S. Trajectory from Bush 2 to Biden. It's really just jam packed with information, resources. And it's such a great read. So I really appreciate your time and telling us about this. We didn't even scratch the surface. So it's it's so much in there, and it's not super, it's your typical kind of 400 pages, not even. So totally manageable, really great book. I'll put it in the show notes at monicaperezshow.com. And Jeremy, tell people where they can see your articles, how the best to support you. If you want them to, if they want to buy the book, should they go to Amazon or go to your website? Tell us that stuff.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I recently set up a Substack, so you can check me out on Substack, where some of the articles are reposted from Covert Action Magazine. So check out www.covertactionmagazine.com, which is dedicated to exposing U.S. covert operations and corruption in government and corrupt, foreign policy intervention and deceits. So please support our magazine if you can in any way. And yeah, you can get the book. It's published by Clarity Press. You can go to Clarity Press. Is one of the few, independent media outlets that publishes books critical of U.S. foreign policy and corruption in government. So check out they've got a good list beside my book. And yeah, you can find my Clinton and Obama book there. I have a website, jeremykuzmarov.com, or you can you can get it on Amazon.
And do you tweet? Because normally I just go to @Covert Action Mag on Twitter if I want to highlight something that you're working on. But are you a big tweeter? Is there any social media where you engage?
I'm not a big Twitter. I do have one, but I'm so busy that I don't have
Yeah,
much time.
good for you. It's not a good use of
Covert
time.
Action is starting to develop. Yeah, it's starting to develop better social media, so you might be able to find it on Twitter.
Yeah, I do go to @Covert Action Mag, and you can find all the latest articles and all of that. So sometimes
Yeah, and if you
they'll
subscribe on our website, you'll get a weekly newsletter with
yes,
all the articles from that week. Or I think it comes out every 10 days or so. So that may be convenient. You don't have to check on the website. You'll just get an email once every 10 days with about 5 or 6 articles, and you can read the ones that interest you.
you have great authors on there, and even your work. Just for me, keeping up reading all of your articles is a challenge. It's jam packed, but I think have I seen Vanessa Beeley there, or are there a lot of authors that really I think provide some firsthand information that you're really not getting from other media outlets. So I do highly
Exactly. Yeah, we
recommend
have like Kit Clarenberg writes for us, and he specializes in exposing color revolutions that the CIA is behind. He actually lives in Serbia, so he's good, and especially in Eastern Europe, and he's been covering the Balkans and European affairs. Yeah, we feature writers like Eva Bartlett who've
Eva
covered
Bartlett. That's it. I said
yeah,
Vanessa Beeley, but it's
war, like in
different. Eva.
Ukraine. She
Yes,
lives in
Eva
Eastern
Bartlett.
Ukraine, and she gives a perspective,
Yeah.
of somebody reporting on the ground in Eastern Ukraine. So the perspective you don't get in the mainstream or corporate media. And yeah, we have a lot of authors, some are specialists in the CIA and have written books about the CIA. And we're looking for new writers. So we'd be happy to receive new submissions.
Very nice. Well, I was thinking about oh shoot, what was I thinking? Oh, the TikTok Act, the Ban TikTok Act. I think a big part of that is to keep us from getting foreign news. So I worry about people, even RT, which is very propaganda-y. It's worse than ever in that regard. But it has. I mean, it's a different perspective, but there's information there, so that when you say you have people from on the ground elsewhere, that is totally different information from what you're getting here. Well, okay. So I won't keep you any longer. Thank you so much for coming, Jeremy. I really appreciated your time and your book.
Well, thanks. I appreciate and thanks for your praise for my book.
I really enjoyed it. I'm not kidding. And I actually probably wouldn't have even wanted to talk to you about it, except for I know how much I enjoy your writing. And, but it over delivered. It was even better than my high expectations. So thank you so much for being here, Jeremy. Thank you all for watching and listening. This is Monica Perez.